Friedrich Paulus's last words before he died are shocking everyone who learns about history, but you might want to get ready before you hear them. History experts were totally surprised. People who study the past didn't see it coming, and even people who knew his story really well couldn't believe what he said before he died. How could a man who was right in the middle of one of the biggest battles of World War II almost take such a secret to his grave? What he finally said is making history experts speechless because it was the very last thing anyone thought he would say. Friedrich Paulus was not born into a military family. He was born on September 23, 1890, in a small town called Breitenau, in a place called Hesse, Germany. His dad was a school teacher, a man who liked order and didn't have much money, while his mom came from a simple farming family. This background didn't make it seem like he would one day be at the center of one of history's worst battles. His childhood was normal, even quiet, but from the start, rules and structure were all around him. As a kid, Friedrich was known to be quiet and kept to himself. Unlike many kids who wanted adventure or to be famous, he didn't have any early stories of breaking rules or doing brave things. What made him different was that he noticed small details and was very careful. He was organized, maybe too much, and more cautious than brave. Friends remembered him as polite, serious, and someone who followed the rules closely. He didn't seem like a future leader of armies, and definitely not someone who would eventually stand up to Hitler himself. His early dream wasn't even about the army. At first, Friedrich wanted to join the Imperial German Navy. The idea of ships, the open sea, and organized life on a boat appealed to him. But the dream never came true. He couldn't get a spot in the Navy because he wasn't very healthy, and his family didn't have important connections. It was disappointing, but it quietly pushed him toward a different path: the Army. In 1910, when he was just 19 years old, Friedrich joined the German Army. He was assigned to the 111th Infantry Regiment as an officer trainee. Here, the young man started his career in a world filled with order, practice drills, and being exact. He wasn't a natural soldier, but he was observant, steady, and reliable. These qualities made him good for office work, where planning and supplies mattered as much as being brave in battle. When World War I started in 1914, it became the real test of his future. While many officers became famous in the trenches, Friedrich found himself doing organizational jobs. He managed operations, supplies, and office duties rather than leading dangerous attacks. To some people, this seemed not very special. But it was here that he got a reputation as someone who could keep things organized even when everything was crazy. His bosses noticed his accuracy and attention to small details, qualities that often meant the difference between disaster and staying alive. Outside of his military duties, Friedrich's personal life brought him into circles far beyond his own background. He married Elena Rosetti Solescu, a Romanian woman from a noble family. This marriage connected him to the rich upper class of another country, and it gave him a social presence he didn't have before. Elena was known for being graceful and strong, and their marriage gave Friedrich stability throughout his career. Despite the pressures of military life, their relationship remained strong. After World War I ended, Germany was left broken. The Treaty of Versailles took away the country's strength, and the Reichswehr, the post-war army, was reduced to only 100,000 men. Many officers were fired, but Friedrich managed to stay. His steady reliability once again proved useful. In the uncertain years of the Weimar Republic, Friedrich quietly moved up the ranks. He was not a man with charm, but in a world of political chaos and changing loyalties, his calm and disciplined personality worked in his favor. By the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler came to power, Friedrich had positioned himself as a dependable officer. He stayed away from politics, focusing instead on his role as a planner and organizer. Unlike more flashy generals, he didn't chase personal fame. Instead, he became known as the man who could map out movements, calculate supplies, and figure out what an army would need. These traits would make him very valuable later, But they also showed his limits, and that perhaps was the most defining trait of all. From his quiet childhood to his steady rise in the army, Friedrich Paulus appeared to be a man shaped by discipline and duty. He was careful, cautious, and obedient, but history was about to place him in a position where following orders would mean destruction. When Friedrich joined the German army in 1910, he stepped into an organization still shaped by tradition, discipline, and a strict chain of command. The Imperial Army was proud with roots going back through centuries of Prussian precision. For someone like Friedrich, who valued order above all else, it was a good fit. Yet even here, he was not the type to stand out on the parade ground or to inspire troops with exciting speeches. Instead, he earned quiet respect for being hard-working and dependable, the sort of officer who followed rules exactly. By the time World War I broke out, Friedrich had already gained experience as a junior officer. The war changed Germany overnight, and the entire army was prepared for a conflict unlike anything Europe had seen before. Many young officers wanted the front lines where they could prove themselves in combat. Friedrich, however, was placed in office positions. His role was not to lead attacks across no man's land, but to manage planning, supplies, and movement. To outsiders, it may have seemed less heroic, but in truth, wars depended as much on supplies as they did on courage. Friedrich's calmness under pressure and attention to detail soon stood out. He was not reckless, and his superiors noticed that he could organize complicated operations with precision. While he never became a celebrated battlefield commander during the war, he was considered reliable, a man who could be trusted with responsibility when everything was chaotic. Some fellow officers described him as reserved to the point of being stiff. Yet in an army where many officers wanted personal fame, his steadiness gave him a unique place. When World War I ended in 1918, Germany was left humiliated. The Versailles Treaty cut the size of its army, took away territories, and forced them to pay crushing debts. Through the 1920s, Friedrich served quietly in various office roles. These years were not marked by dramatic battles or quick promotions. Instead, they were a period of slow, steady advancement. He attended military schools, studied organization, and improved his skills in strategy and supplies. To many, he seemed destined to remain a middle-ranking officer, a man whose career would be respectable but unremarkable. But the traits he had, caution, detail, and discipline, were slowly shaping him into the kind of officer who would one day be trusted with far greater responsibility. One thing that stood out during these between-war years was his cautious personality. Unlike some officers who openly criticized the political chaos of the Weimar government or later joined themselves quickly with Adolf Hitler's rising movement, Friedrich avoided politics. He was a soldier, nothing more. He stuck to his duties and left the speeches and beliefs to others. In hindsight, this neutrality protected him. He was neither too tied to the old imperial guard nor too closely connected with the radical right. It allowed him to be seen as a professional rather than a political figure, which became increasingly important as the Nazi Party gained power. Colleagues noted that Friedrich was not a man of vision or daring. He lacked the charisma of men like Erwin Rommel or Heinz Guderian. What he had, however, was an unshakable sense of duty. If given an order, he would follow it exactly. If asked to plan a movement of thousands of men and supplies, he could produce it with careful accuracy. For superiors who valued obedience and reliability, Friedrich was exactly the kind of officer they needed. As the 1930s went on and Hitler took control, Germany began to secretly build up its military, breaking the restrictions of Versailles. The Reichswehr transformed into the Wehrmacht, and officers who had survived the lean between-war years suddenly found themselves rising quickly as the army expanded. Friedrich was among them. His long years of quiet service began to pay off. When World War II started in September 1939, Friedrich Paulus was not yet a famous name. He was a career officer skilled in office work, a man who had risen through discipline and patience rather than bold victories. But war has a way of pushing certain men forward, sometimes faster than they expect. For Friedrich, the rapid growth of the German military machine created opportunities he could never have imagined in the quieter years of the Reichswehr. At the start of the war, Friedrich served under high-ranking officers, often in planning and organizational roles. He was deeply involved in office work, where he coordinated the movement of men, supplies, and tanks across huge territories. These roles might not have had the glamour of battlefield command, but they were crucial to the quick German victories in the early years of the war. His superiors began to recognize that Friedrich's gift for precision and detail made him invaluable in preparing complex operations. In 1940, during the invasion of France, Friedrich worked under General Gerhard von Rundstedt as a senior staff officer. This campaign was one of the Wehrmacht's greatest successes, with Germany defeating France in just 6 weeks. For Friedrich, the campaign reinforced his reputation as a careful planner who could turn ambitious strategies into workable operations. While others won fame in the press, Friedrich remained in the shadows, a man whose work was known to insiders, but not to the public. The next major step came when Friedrich was appointed as Deputy Chief of Staff of the German Army. This was no small achievement. In this role, he worked closely with some of the most powerful generals of the time. Yet his style remained the same: reserved, precise, cautious. He was not one to argue forcefully with superiors. And this habit of deference would later shape the way he handled Adolf Hitler's increasingly rigid commands. By 1941, Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history, with millions of men pouring across the border. Friedrich played an important role in the planning stages. He was part of the team that mapped out the enormous supplies required to move armies hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Though initially successful, Barbarossa soon revealed the difficulties of fighting in such vast spaces. Supply lines stretched thin, and the quick victory Hitler had promised never came. It was during this time that Friedrich began to emerge from the background. His steady service and ability to manage complex details caught the attention of his superiors. In 1942, he was promoted to general and given a command of his own, the 6th Army. This was no ordinary assignment. The 6th Army was one of Germany's most powerful field units, equipped with tanks, artillery, and more than 250,000 men. For a man who had spent much of his career behind desks and maps, the leap to commanding such a force was huge. Hitler valued officers who would follow orders without question, and Friedrich fit that mold perfectly. The 6th Army's mission in 1942 was to advance deep into Soviet territory and capture Stalingrad, the city on the Volga River that had Joseph Stalin's name. Stalingrad was not only a strategic target, but also a symbolic one. Hitler believed that taking the city would deal a crushing blow to Soviet morale. The task fell to Friedrich, who now carried the burden of commanding hundreds of thousands of men in one of the most ambitious offensives of the war. At first, the 6th Army made rapid progress. German forces pushed through Soviet defenses, and by the summer of 1942, they were closing in on Stalingrad. But the deeper they went, the more stretched their supply lines became. Ammunition, food, and fuel were harder to deliver. The terrain was vast, the resistance got stronger, and Soviet reinforcements poured into the region. What had seemed like another quick German victory was turning into a drawn-out and brutal fight. At first, the 6th Army advanced with determination. German forces pressed deeper into the city, but Soviet resistance was fierce. Fighting turned into a nightmarish struggle from one street to the next, with factories, apartment buildings, and even sewer tunnels becoming battlegrounds. Soviet soldiers, often supported by regular people, refused to give up ground. They held on to the western bank of the Volga with such determination that German progress slowed to a crawl. All the while, Friedrich's men grew weary. The fighting had stretched on for months, and supply lines were collapsing under the weight of distance. Ammunition was scarce, food was limited, and winter was closing in. The Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units holding the German flanks were poorly equipped, vulnerable, and already demoralized. Any experienced strategist could see what was coming. The Soviet counteroffensive in November 1942 was decisive. Operation Uranus struck at the weak Axis allies on the flanks of the Sixth Army, breaking through with overwhelming force. Within days, the German forces in Stalingrad found themselves surrounded. More than 250,000 men were trapped inside a tightening Soviet ring. In that moment, the German High Command faced a clear choice. The Sixth Army still had mobility, fuel, and the ability to move its wounded. A breakout attempt could have saved much of the force, but Hitler in his headquarters far from the front refused. He ordered Friedrich to hold Stalingrad at all costs, promising that supplies would be flown in by air. It was an impossible promise. The Luftwaffe, stretched to its limits, could never deliver enough food and fuel to keep an entire army alive. Yet Friedrich, bound by discipline and habit, obeyed. He hesitated to openly disobey Hitler, even as his soldiers starved and froze in the ruins of the city. As conditions worsened, Friedrich's authority as commander was tested in ways he had never experienced before. Hunger gnawed at the troops, frostbite spread, ammunition ran dangerously low. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags for warmth, and medical supplies were so scarce that the wounded often went untreated. Still, Hitler insisted the Sixth Army remain in place. Many of Friedrich's subordinates urged him to disobey. Walter von Seydlitz, one of his generals, pressed him to order a breakout and save what remained of the army. Others pointed out that the airlift was failing and that surrender would at least spare countless lives. But Friedrich, loyal and cautious, refused to act on his own initiative. For weeks, the Sixth Army withered inside the Soviet trap. By January 1943, the situation was hopeless. The Soviets launched their final offensive, crushing the last German resistance. Hitler promoted Friedrich to the rank of Field Marshal, a title no German officer had ever held before without victory. It was a cruel gesture. Hitler expected him to follow tradition. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The implication was clear. Friedrich was supposed to take his own life rather than surrender. But Friedrich did not see it that way. When the Soviets advanced into his command post at Stalingrad on January 31, 1943, Friedrich surrendered. It was the first time a German field marshal had been taken alive. In captivity, Friedrich's stance changed. Along with officers like von Seydlitz, he joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, an anti-Nazi organization made up of German prisoners of war. He publicly urged other German leaders to lay down their arms, declaring that continued loyalty to Hitler would only bring more destruction. By the mid-1950s, Friedrich Paulus was a shadow of the man who once commanded hundreds of thousands at Stalingrad. Kept it in the Soviet Union until the end of the war, he had eventually been released and allowed to settle in East Germany. The government there presented him as a figure who had broken with Hitler, a general who had seen the truth and urged his countrymen to abandon Nazism. For years he gave interviews and appeared at official events, always careful to distance himself from the regime he once served. But behind the public image was an aging man who carried the weight of memory. By 1957, Friedrich was in poor health. Years of captivity, stress, and the toll of age had weakened him. He was taken to a hospital in Dresden, where doctors did what they could. But his condition was clear. The man who had once stood at the heart of one of the war's most decisive battles now lay in a simple hospital bed, thin and frail, his body failing him. Dressed in a hospital gown, his features sharp from illness, he often wore an oxygen mask to help him breathe. It was in this quiet, clinical setting that Friedrich's final reflections came to light. This was Friedrich Paulus's final confession before death, and last words that shocked the world. "I can't keep this hidden anymore. I had no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal," his cutting reference to Hitler. Nurses and visitors remembered him as calm, sometimes distant, but also thoughtful. He was not a man of outbursts in his final days. His strength was fading, but his mind remained sharp. Friedrich had long been clear on one point. He was a Roman Catholic, and for him, suicide was unthinkable. Years earlier, when Hitler promoted him to field marshal at Stalingrad, the expectation had been obvious. German tradition said that a man of such rank would never allow himself to be captured alive. But Friedrich had refused. Even in the desperate days of Stalingrad, he had forbidden his soldiers from exposing themselves reckless lies by telling them not to stand in trenches simply to be shot. He valued life even when the war tried to strip it away. In February 1957, Friedrich Paulus passed away in Dresden. He was 66 years old. His final words linger long after his body was laid to rest. The voice of a man who in his last moments admitted what discipline and obedience had once prevented him from saying. When Friedrich Paulus died in Dresden in February 1957, the immediate response was shaped as much by politics as by memory. In East Germany, where he had spent his final years, the government portrayed him as a man who had broken with Hitler and embraced a new anti-fascist stance. They organized a funeral that presented him as a symbol of redemption, the general who had once been loyal to the Reich, but had eventually turned his back on it. Photographs from that time show officials in uniform, wreaths plaid by the East German state, and serious speeches emphasizing his rejection of Nazism. Yet the tone in West Germany was very different. To many, he was not a hero, but a controversial figure. Veterans who had fought at Stalingrad accused him of cowardice, claiming he had failed to save his men when retreat might still have been possible. Despite the political divide, what unified reactions across Germany was the recognition that his story was unlike any other German commander. He was the only field marshal they had ever captured alive, the man whose surrender had symbolized the turning point of World War II. And in the years after his death, his final words became a subject of heated debate. In East Germany, those words were used to show that even the highest-ranking generals could repent. For the state, they confirmed the idea that the Nazi elite had led Germany to ruin and that true honor lay in breaking with fascism, even if belatedly. Textbooks and speeches quoted him selectively, highlighting his criticism of Hitler while downplaying his years of service to the regime. The debate around his legacy grew chassané. Our pair, as survivors of Stalingrad, told their stories. Some recalled him as distant, bound by duty to the end. Others remembered his attempts to spare them senseless death in the final days of the battle when he forbade reckless sacrifice. In the decades since, historians have continued to wrestle with these questions. Some argue that he embodied the dangers of a military culture built on absolute obedience. His life, they say, illustrates how discipline, when stripped of moral judgment, can lead to disaster. Others see him as a tragic figure, a man who recognized too late that loyalty to a corrupt leader is no virtue at all. What gives his final confession its enduring power is not that it redeems him, but that it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of human weakness. Paulus was not a monster, nor was he a martyr. He was a man caught between loyalty and conscience, who admitted at the end that he had chosen wrong. His words resonate because they echo far beyond Stalingrad. They speak to the dangers of following orders blindly, of mistaking obedience for honor. Today, more than 6 decades after his death, Friedrich Paulus remains a divisive figure. His name is inseparable from Stalingrad, the battle that turned the tide of the war and sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. Who was the worst out of Hitler's generals? Let us know in the comments.